Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest magazine, and I'm pleased to present today two contributors to our cover story, Who's Worse? A look at President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. The National Interest has a long history of producing debates on major issues, and this issue, with our cover story featuring Dimitri K, President and CEO of the National Interest and the Center for the National Interest, and Dov Zakheim, former Comptroller in the Pentagon, and also a member of the board of the Center for the National Interest and a valued contributor to the magazine, is no exception. In it, Dimitri makes the case for Trump. He acknowledges Trump's numerous weaknesses, but contends that overall, given the current state of the Democratic Party, that Trump is not simply the best option, but really the only option that can be considered in this November election. Dov disagrees. He argues that Trump's record over the past 3.5 years has been abysmal, harming both America domestically and, in his view, helping to shatter the nimbus of American leadership abroad that it has enjoyed since the end of World War II. I am pleased to announce that they will now debate this issue on our webinar, and I'm delighted that you have joined us to watch it. And I should urge you at the beginning to note that at the bottom of your screen, you can type in a question to either or both of our speakers today, and I very much hope that you will. I'm going to begin with Dimitri, who will lay out the case for Trump, and then I will turn to Dov, who will speak about the case against Trump. Dimitri?
Jacob, thank you very much. Let me say first that I am absolutely delighted to have a debate about Trump and Biden with Dov Zakheim. Dov is not only a great mind, a person of great accomplishment, but also vice chairman of the center, so in a certain sense, my boss. We had an opportunity either to say nothing about this election in terms of any kind of endorsement, or to produce some lowest common denominator. We decided against it. So we decided to present two contrasting opinions. Neither of these opinions represents an institutional view of the National Interest magazine or the Center for the National Interest. Having said that, I read Dov Zakheim's piece carefully, and I think that we are in a fundamental agreement that President Trump has a number of very serious flaws. But not only serious flaws in terms of his worldview, in terms of his conduct, but even in his character. If I argue in my piece, this was a referendum on President Trump, in most presidential elections, when you have a sitting president, referendums on whoever is in the White House, if that was that kind of a referendum, I think it would be very difficult to make a case that Donald Trump deserves re-election. But this is not a referendum on Donald Trump. The Democrats would want to turn it into a referendum on Donald Trump. But this is a much more complex election, because there are two very different candidates, there are two very different parties, and there are two very different visions for America. And there is something else. If Donald Trump was a president during any normal period, you could judge him by normal criteria. But I argue in my piece that he was subjected by the Democrats to a protracted torture, to a moral equivalent of waterboarding. And that's what they were doing to him, his family, and his entourage almost immediately after his re-election, and actually even before. So it is amazing that he was even able to perform his duties, to focus on his responsibilities under that kind of an enormous moral and sometimes almost physical pressure. I think that if you look at how Trump handled the pandemics, there are very few good things I can say about it, perhaps no good things. I don't think he had careful planning. I don't think he had good analysis. I don't think he was able to work effectively with democratic governors and mayors. I also think that the riots were a case of his, to use Jimmy Carter's language, incomplete success. I'm sure that he tried hard. I assume he meant well, but nonetheless, he was not able to deal effectively with the riots, and he was not able to develop an effective division of responsibility with states and municipalities. I also think that if you are talking about the country being divided, well, it's certainly more divided than almost ever before since the Civil War. In my view, Obama was a very divisive president, but Trump much more so. Enough about Trump's imperfections. Dov will, I'm sure, talk about this more convincingly and more eloquently. But let's remember what Trump had right. Trump first understood that the country was fundamentally dissatisfied with previous policies. The country was dissatisfied with political correctness. The country was dissatisfied with the blind momentum of American post-Cold War dominant global hegemonic temptation. All these old formulas which were developed during the Cold War and which were applied to a totally different period without any careful analysis. I think that that was constructive. That Donald Trump began questioning them. And I did not see and did not hear him suggesting any unilateral American surrender, totally breaking the alliances. Sometimes he used an overly dramatic language, but basically he was talking about the allies having to deliver their fair share, about Russia not being an enemy of the United States. Mind you, an adversary, a ruthless competitor, but not a mortal enemy around which all American forency has to be built. I think that Trump understood that uncontrolled immigration is a great threat to American democracy and to American prosperity. And this, if we are talking about any fair voting, you cannot have a situation of millions of people crossing the border and becoming American citizens in several years. You just cannot pretend that this is a serious, reliable, democratic electoral process. I think that Obama also led the Americans to believe that we have systematic racism, that there was no fundamental change in the United States in terms of how African Americans were treated, how minorities were treated. I thought that Obama's assumption of fundamental American racism, I think it was unsubstantiated. I think it was unfair to the majority of Americans, and even more to the point, I thought that it was bound to create a powerful backlash and generate very serious divisions in the American society. So once Trump said, no, let's wait a minute, maybe the situation is not that bad. Maybe the way to deal with the remnants of racial discrimination is to eliminate these remnants, but not to create new preferred categories, not to have identity politics, not to decide that certain groups, protected groups, are right by definition in any dispute with other Americans, that there is something almost unsavory about providing opportunities to African Americans by denying opportunities to other groups of Americans. For instance, obviously, African Americans, they came to the United States mostly not at their free will. They were delivered here by their slave owners, slave traders in Africa, and they had a horrible, horrible history in the United States. But you know, there are people who came here as a result of Holocaust, as a result of communist terror in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, terrible atrocities which happened in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and etc. And these people, their descendants, also were supposed to have rights and to be treated equally. And I thought that it was very appropriate on Trump's part to say that we should guarantee racial equality rather than racial preferences. When I look at the Democratic Party today, it became a very radical party. I don't want to consider anybody guilty by association, but in my view, Black Lives Matter is a radical organization, and a number of their leaders openly support violence. I think that there is no question that a number of American cities, including Chicago, including Portland, we have seen violent mobs terrorizing law enforcement and their fellow Americans, and democratic governors, democratic mayors refuse to provide any protection. And you know what? As somebody who came to the United States in 1973 from communist totalitarianism, and I thought that America was indeed beacon of freedom, and I still think so. I was offended to see leaders of Democrats in Congress to stand on their knee. I just think that is not American. And let me conclude by reminding how Speaker Pelosi had difficulty raising from her knee. She needed help to make it happen. You know what? To get on your knees is easier than to raise back. And I am not sure that if we stand on their knees in international politics, we would have many others who will help us to come back. Under those circumstances, I think that we are not just have to make a choice between the two candidates. We have to make a choice between two visions for America. On the basis of that choice, I think that Trump is a stronger candidate.
Dimitri, thank you for that clear and forceful exposition. We'll now turn to Dov for his response.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for having me on. And I share Dimitri's concerns. I also want to say, first of all, I'm not entirely in agreement with Dimitri that we're just speaking for ourselves. I think in a sense, what Dimitri and I, and we're good friends, are representing is the fact that the Center for the National Interest is nonpartisan and reflects both sides and encourages debate, reasoned debate, disagreement, because that's how things should be. Reasonable people can disagree. I've known Dimitri for a very long time. I've worked alongside him, and I respect him very much. And on this issue, I don't agree with him at all. Let me sort of address some of what Dimitri said, but also in context of what he wrote. Both what he just said now and what he wrote about began with an acknowledgement of Trump's faults, but he broadened it to be a discussion of the Democratic Party, the Democratic Congress. So here I have to say at the outset, I'm a lifelong Republican. I don't agree with the Democratic Party. My concern is precisely Mr. Trump. I'm going to vote straight Republican, as I always have, except for the president and vice president of the United States. And oh, by the way, to label these two people as somehow as extremist as the left wing of the Democratic Party just is simply unfair because they've been attacked by the left wing of the Democratic Party, including, by the way, the leaders of the Marxist leaders, as they happen to be, of Black Lives Matter, who've actually accused Kamala Harris of being not extreme enough. So let's not discuss the Democratic Party or some of their extreme backers. We're talking about Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. Now, I'm glad that Dimitri acknowledged Mr. Trump's faults, but he kind of said, well, okay, let's get past that. And now let's talk about other things. I'd like to address some of the other things up front and then some others a little bit later. One of the areas that Dimitri talked about here and talks about at some length in his article, which, by the way, is exceedingly well written, is the whole question of what is Russia vis-a-vis the United States. Now, it's only the other day that the bipartisan report, by the way, chaired by a Republican, with a Republican majority, that is the Senate report, made very, very clear that Russia's more than merely some kind of adversary. It makes very clear that while there was not, they couldn't say anything about collusion, but there was clearly some degree of cooperation between the Trump campaign and the Russians, including Mr. Putin himself, which begs the question, why does Mr. Trump kowtow to Mr. Putin so much? And I can give you chapter and verse. I don't want to use up all my 10 minutes giving you chapter and verse, but the fact of the matter is that page after page of this report talks about how the Russians tried to disrupt American democracy. To me, anybody who wants to disrupt my democracy, my country, is an enemy, full stop. Not a partial friend, an enemy. But let me go beyond that. In 2018, so Mr. Trump was in office, a group called the Wagner Group, or the Wagner Group, attacked American troops in Syria. Now, this isn't a New York Times report. This is Mike Pompeo when he was head of the CIA, who's now Secretary of State. We had about 40 or 50 people. They had several hundred. They came with tanks. They came with armored personnel carriers. They came with artillery, and they fired on our people. Luckily, we're a hell of a lot better than they are. We called in our air, and we wiped them out. Or as Jim Mattis said, we completely destroyed them. Mattis was Secretary of Defense at the time. People who fire on us, and by the way, don't tell me that this group has no connections to the Kremlin. They train in Russian defense bases. Just last month, the head of one of our generals, rather, of Africa Command pointed out that the Wagner Group was being resupplied in Libya by the Russian military. These guys are totally connected with the Russian military, and they fired on our people. I don't call that adversaries. I call that enemies. Let me now flip to some of the other issues that lead me to say that we have to get Mr. Trump out of the White House. First of all, he didn't create racism in this country, but boy, has he fueled it. And it isn't just Charlottesville where he said, oh, there were nice people on both sides. This has gone on and on. He supports keeping Confederate names for our bases, even though our own Defense Department wants to get rid of them, and our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whom he appointed, has said that these people are traitors. They're not heroes, they are traitors. And by the way, those bases were named during the Jim Crow era. There were reasons for that. The Army wanted to recruit people from the South. We're in a different place. This isn't bending over to Black Lives Matter. This is just recognizing that we shouldn't honor traitors. Do we have bases named after Benedict Arnold? What is the difference? And Arnold just spied on us. These guys fired on us, shot our people because they wanted to break away from the Union. So again, this is where Mr. Trump is. Who are his biggest supporters? Who are his most vocal supporters? David Duke, the Klansman. I don't want a president whose strongest supporters are David Duke, and who, by the way, says nice things about the QAnon people, the conspiracy theorists like Marjorie Greene, who just got a Republican nomination for Congress, and the president congratulated her. What about the pandemic? Dimitri acknowledges that the pandemic is not exactly Mr. Trump's brightest moment. But look, month after month, and I quote him in my article, month after month, he said, oh, it's going to go away. Oh, it's all right. Oh, it's a big deal. He even called it a hoax. And what does he recommend? People should drink all kinds of liquids that might kill their insides, but save them from the disease. He quotes doctors who believe in succubuses. If you don't know what a succubus is, it's a female devil that's going to get men at night. This is the doctor that our president quotes. You know, all he had to do, if he wasn't so self-centered, was to say, first, follow the doctor's advice, and second, invoke the Defense Production Act, which in March would have gotten companies to start producing what we call PPE, personal protective equipment. He still hasn't done that. This is a man who knows everything. This is the stable genius. This is the man who simply cannot tolerate any kind of advice or criticism or suggestions that don't follow his gut. This is a man who he doesn't like NATO. He'd like to get out of NATO. He's told his people he'd like to get out of NATO. He's upset about China. He brought it on himself. Had he not withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Economic Partnership, we would have been able to encircle China economically. But he pulled out. So everybody starts looking to China. We have a problem with the man's character, with the man's policies, with the man's incompetence, self-centeredness, and I'll tell you something else, and I'm speaking now as a grandfather of 16. What are my grandchildren going to look up to? What are they going to see? Can I tell them, you too could be president of the United States? And they'll say, do you want us to be like that? I'll stop here.
Dov, thank you for that impassioned and also extremely forceful presentation of your views. I'm now going to turn to Dimitri, and I'm going to ask each of you a question. And the question that I'd like to ask Dimitri, which I'd already formulated before this, but it actually builds a little bit off of Dov's presentation as well, is a lot of people have told me that they found your description of Trump's weaknesses extremely powerful and compelling. So why should someone who reads your article conclude that the true authoritarian threat really emerges from the Democrats rather than from Trump himself? If you have a neutral observer who say is an independent voter, doesn't have strong views on either candidate, what would you say is dispositive about the allegation that authoritarianism is really embodied by the Democrats and not by Trump?
Jacob, thank you, but if you don't mind, I will spend 2 minutes responding to something Dov have said about Russia. First, I have read very carefully the Senate report, and I have read particularly portions which dealt with events I knew something about it. The report is long, so I cannot say that I agree with everything that I have not quite read. But what I have read was exactly on target. And I have seen nothing in this report that would suggest that there was cooperation between Trump, his campaign leadership, and Russia. I do not know what Mr. Putin was thinking, and I do not know what his preferences were. It's a complex question, much more complex than the Democrats would like us to believe. But what I do know, that even sanctions aside, because there are more sanctions against Russia now than when Trump took office, but you can make a case that these sanctions were mostly initiated by Congress. But there are other things which clearly were done by Trump. And I am glad that Dov mentioned what has happened in Syria when Russian mercenaries went under attack. Now, first of all, let's be clear whom they went under attack against. Dov quite correctly mentioned that there were Americans there. But these were not American forces that were attacked by the Russians. These were forces under American protections. The forces of Syrian opposition and mostly the Kurds. That's point number one. There is still a difference. The United States quite appropriately attacks forces in Syria which are under Russian protection, and we don't call it an attack on Russia. And the Russians don't call it an attack on Russia, even if there is a collateral damage. But second, very important thing has happened. President Trump approved recommendation of his Secretary of Defense, Mr. Mattis, to respond disproportionately and literally to eliminate most of the Russian attackers. And they consulted the Russian command in Syria, whether these were Russian forces who were taking pro-American elements. The Russians denied any responsibility for these forces, and we went and destroyed them. I think it was a proud moment for the American military, and I think it was a proud moment for Mr. Trump. And as far as Secretary Mattis is concerned, well, Dov knows very well that we have honored Secretary Mattis at the center of the national interest. Dov knows that because he was at the head table. And then Dov may remember that Secretary Mattis very specifically talking about his definition of American national interest, mentioned my article on that very subject in our magazine and said that it was very close to they were approaching how the United States should define American world priorities. I am very impressed with Secretary Mattis, and I am very impressed with what he was able to do under President Trump. And I don't think that any Russian who had encounter with Trump and his administration would think that he was a wimp accommodating Putin. Now, more about the authoritarian temptation. Look, you have asked a very good question. And this is one area where I don't have a very good answer. Because clearly, Trump has an authoritarian temptation. He clearly has difficulty with accepting opinions of others. And I would go beyond that. Well, taking too seriously democratic procedures does not always naturally come to him. Having said that, we had Trump for almost 4 years. And I think it's pretty clear that he may have an occasional authoritarian impulse, but he does not have an authoritarian agenda. Despite his great distaste, for instance, for CNN, CNN is able to do whatever they want to do and even continue to have their correspondent in the White House. The Democrats became the paragons of political correctness. It is people associated with the Democrats and supported by the Democratic congressional leadership who are trying to prevent any meaningful debate in the United States, who claim that opinions of others which we disagree, that these opinions are not only wrong-headed, but they're immoral. It is people supporting the Democrats, not people supporting Trump, who try to prevent conservative speakers speaking at university campuses. You know how many people are being fired simply because they said that something that is politically incorrect. So I think that while both parties have an authoritarian temptation, the danger of that temptation becoming a government policy is much higher under the Democrats than under Donald Trump.
Thank you, Dimitri. I'd now like to pose a question to Dov. Dov, you emphasized in your remarks that Trump is battening from the favor of figures such as David Duke. But doesn't this run the risk of overly simplifying and perhaps adopting a bit of the Hillary Clinton attitude of dismissing Trump supporters as deplorables en masse? Because many of the people that supported Trump, at least in 2016, were either middle-class professionals or not necessarily people who espouse or adhere to a racist mindset, let alone ideology. So isn't the David Duke reference, do you think that explains this, or do you think you're might be going too far there?
Well, first I want to reply to a couple of things that Dimitri said. In terms of what the Russians may or may not have done, let me just quote. I have a lot of quotes, and I will give you the page number. Look at the committee report, because Dimitri said the committee report really didn't talk about collusion. It certainly didn't. But here's what it did say, page 170 of the report, and I'm quoting here. The committee found that Russian President Vladimir Putin directed the hack and leak campaign targeting the Democratic National Committee, the Congressional Committee, and the Clinton campaign. Moscow's intent was to damage the Clinton campaign and tarnish what it expected might be a Clinton administration, help the Trump campaign after Trump became the presumptive Republican nominee, and generally undermine the US democratic process. That is, it may not be collusion, but it certainly means that they were trying to help Mr. Trump. As for what happened in Syria, it wasn't the Kurds that were really under attack. There were a bunch of Delta Force people. They called in some Marine help. There weren't too many of them. There were 40 of them, and they were being hit by artillery. So let's not say this was just Kurds and Syrian Defense Democratic Forces or whatever. Now, as to your question, I never said that these are all deplorables. What I did say is that his support includes the likes of David Duke, who seem to enjoy all the dog whistles that he keeps putting out. The fact that he said that there were nice people or decent people on both sides in Charlottesville doesn't impugn all of his 60-odd million voters. There were a lot of people who were fed up with Obama. There were a lot of people who wanted change, and he seemed to represent change. And I even wrote an article that said he might grow into the job. After all, Harry Truman was a political hack till he became president. The difference is that Harry Truman recognized the buck stops here. This president doesn't do that. He doesn't unite the country. If the country was divided under Obama, it's so much more divided today. And again, I will emphasize, this isn't about the Democratic Party. If you don't like the Democrats, and I don't particularly, vote Republican, but split your ticket. Vote Republican and vote Biden.
Thank you, Dov. I'm now we've got a couple questions.
But Jake, I need to respond to that.
Sure.
First, about what happened in Syria. My facts are slightly different than Dov's, but I don't want to spend any time on that because we came to the same conclusion. The Russians were attacking. the United States had to respond. The response was powerful and effective. Where I don't think we necessarily agree, I think that Trump has to get credit for that. And what we have seen from President Obama when he was in the White House, I don't think that he would be prepared to act with that kind of decisiveness and take those kind of risks. But more fundamental point Dov made is a point about the Republican and Democratic joint report on Russian interference. Look, I was not saying that the Russians were not trying to interfere. As a matter of fact, I said it several times on Russian TV. Incidentally, I said it, debating Russian foreign minister and press secretary to the Russian president. I said it to them point blank. I don't need to be persuaded that what the Russians were doing was damaging to American democracy. But let's make a distinction between a man called Vladimir Putin and a man called Donald Trump. I did not say that the Russians were not interfering. The report certainly said that the Russians were interfering. But the report makes very clear that there was no meaningful collaboration between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And moreover, that at no point anybody in a responsible position in the Trump campaign even attempted to explore collaboration with the Russians. That, I think, is a very important point which we should consider thinking about Trump's record.
Well, let me just say that there's a whole section in the report about Paul Manafort and what he was doing when he was chairman of the campaign. I acknowledge there's no proof of collusion. Was there collaboration? Yes, there was. Was it intended to help Mr. Trump? Yes, it did. And at the end of the day, one has to ask, why does Mr. Trump simply kowtow to Mr. Putin? Why hasn't he, for example, even mentioned to Mr. Putin the issue of bounties in Afghanistan? Now, you might say, well, he ignores his intelligence community. He's already said publicly that he values Mr. Putin's view over the intelligence communities. But it isn't just the intelligence community that said it now. Mr. Pompeo raised it as well. Why doesn't Mr. Trump say anything? That's what keeps eating at me. So on the one hand, he doesn't say anything. And on the other hand, it's quite clear that to call Russia anything other than an enemy when they're trying to destroy the fabric of this country is simply beyond my comprehension. And I'll stop there.
Well, I'm not going to respond to that because clearly we disagree on this issue. And we particularly disagree because I did not mention before something Trump has mentioned on several occasions. That of course the United States, and particularly under the previous Obama administration, was actively involved in the Russian political process. And you may say that what we do to influence Russian politics is not morally similar to what the Russians do to undermine American democracy, but Dov, you're more than sufficiently experienced to know that in our geopolitics, if you do something to another superpower, you have to expect a certain kind of retaliation. And if you want to stop Russian interference, there is a whole variety of things you need to do, but you also have to think about American own posture. And if you are not prepared to think about American own posture in terms of Russian political process, then whatever we would do, we would see some Russian interference. Perhaps we have to accept that.
Well, we have several queries from our audience, which I'd like to begin posing now. And I'd also encourage anyone watching right now that you can, at the bottom of your screen, submit a query yourself. Our initial question is from Melinda Herring of the Atlantic Council. And her question is directed to both of our speakers. But it is this: why is Trump's foreign policy superior to Biden's? She would like to ask Dimitri, and the reverse to Dov? Why is Biden superior to Trump? Dimitri, if you could tackle that first.
Well, I have a lot of problems with Trump's foreign policy, particularly with its implementation. And I think he very often has good instincts, but he doesn't know how to act on them, how to develop a coherent policy, and how to develop a command which he would trust and which would be prepared to work with him. Having said that, I think that Trump was right assuming that we live in a fundamentally different world, that it requires new approaches, and that just talking about American exceptionism and about being a unipolar, making all decisions for the whole mankind, which became popular during two previous administrations, that is not the right answer. I do not know what would be Biden's foreign policy, because while he was chairman of Foreign Affairs Committee, he doesn't have much of an independent foreign policy record. I do know, however, that people around him, they take a lot of polemical positions, which do not, in my view, reflect serious analytical thinking. I see a very strong interventionist syndrome, a temptation to follow, to support our allies blindly, even those of them who are not even our formal allies, just friends like Ukraine or Georgia, without thinking about consequences. And I do not see one very important thing about Trump. One thing about Trump which appeals to me, and Dov, I'm sure, disagrees with that, but one thing about Trump that appeals to me, that he is a fighter, that when he goes after Russia, the Russians know maybe he would not raise certain things in a conversation with Putin because of the way Trump believes he conducts diplomacy, where you talk to another leader, it's not about lectures and confrontation. But Trump knows how to use American military power, and he is not ashamed and hesitant in doing it. And when I think about the United States becoming a great moral lecturer and a great missionary trying to improve everybody else, and they would think that he's trying to change the regimes in the process. But then when push comes to shove, it already happened several times in recent American history, our instinct would be to run away with our tail, you know where. I just don't think that is a kind of effective foreign policy for the United States we want to see.
Dov?
Well, I don't totally agree with everything Mr. Biden says, but there are a number of things that I think really contrast the two. I mentioned already TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Mr. Trump walked away from it. He walks away from all international agreements, and it's not clear that all of them should be walked away from. I mean, for a start, I, for instance, totally disagreed with the Iran deal. But once you sign something, once America gives its word, it needs to keep its word. One of our problems over time has been we double cross our friends, and it never, ever works out. We double-crossed the Shah. Look what we've had ever since. We double-crossed Mubarak, and now everybody's complaining about Sisi. Double-crossing doesn't work. So that's number one. Number two, Mr. Biden has long been a supporter of NATO. It's not a matter of blind support. Why are we in Europe? Because if there's a war, it ain't going to be in America. It'll be in Europe. And it's worth providing a nuclear umbrella to deter that war completely. So there's a benefit. I don't know how much money you want to attach. And I was comptroller of the Pentagon. I know a little bit about billions of dollars. First of all, a lot of these countries, we base there. It would cost us more to come home, frankly. It's going to cost us more by pulling those 12,000 troops out of Germany and leaving 5 in Italy. We're going to have to put money into Italy. We're going to have to put money into the States. It's going to cost us more. But what about the fact that the Germans have an agreement that I happen to have signed back in 1982, which says that in a crisis, they're going to provide 93,000 troops. And what about all those bases? And what about the training in Europe? How do you price that? Mr. Trump doesn't think about those things at all. Mr. Trump loves tariffs. He says he's a tariff man. Guess what? All tariffs do is tax the American people. If you want to stop China, focus on their students, focus on their postgrads, focus on their professors that are in this country, the several 100,000 of them that steal our intellectual property. Don't raise tariffs. I mean, you're going back to the 1930s. How well did it work out then? Biden's not that way. So there are a number of things. And as for moral lectureship, John Quincy Adams was a moral lecturer. Ronald Reagan was a moral lecturer. He didn't go to war with the Soviet Union, but he said, tear down that wall. That's what we've always stood for. Mr. Trump is amoral.
Dov, Kurt Mills from the American Conservative wants to put you on the hot seat. He says, fair enough that Harris and Biden have moderate pedigrees, but the election has changed substantially since Biden and Harris ran for president. Back during the primaries, we had a supercharged economy, no pandemic, and George Floyd was alive. It's fairly clear from the Democratic convention that what Kurt calls a, quote, obsession, unquote, with race will take center stage in a Biden administration. As a Republican, don't you believe that a Biden victory would vindicate some pretty worrying tendencies?
Well, that all depends. That's a great question. And being a conservative since I was in college, I was at Columbia. And let me tell you, I watched radicals up front. No fun. These guys were all a bunch of spoiled kids who knew they'd go into daddy's businesses so they could afford to be radicals. Hasn't changed all that much. Look, voting for Biden is not voting for AOC. It's not voting for all these extremists. You want to prevent Biden from doing that kind of thing, which I don't know that he would do, but if he tried, you need a Republican Congress. As I said, I'm voting straight Republican except for president, because this president is not the kind of person that should be in the White House. But if you've got issues with Democratic policies, and boy, I share them with you, that's not the way to deal with the problem.
Well, I have China questions for each of our speakers. First, I'll go to Dimitri. Former Ambassador John Evans asks, Dimitri, how can you be so bullish on Trump's foreign policy when almost every article on China in the latest issue of the National Interest warns about the dangerous approach of the Trump administration towards China?
It's a very good question, Ambassador Evans. I am not bullish on Trump foreign policy. I started my article with several pages of disagreeing with Trump's foreign policy, and I said that I made my disagreements clear during the discussion. And incidentally, I agree with Dov Zakheim on the issue of tariffs. I think we're mishandling the relationship with China, and I'm particularly concerned when we're simultaneously challenging China and Russia, pushing them closer to each other. I also have to say that I disagree with what Secretary Pompeo in particular is doing now, constantly talking about the Chinese Communist Party as a kind of a source of our problems in China. That creates an impression that it would be very difficult for China, no matter what substantive concessions they make, to reach any understanding with the United States, unless they change regime. Assuming we don't have a regime policy vis-a-vis China, that is not a message to Beijing we want to send. I'm also grateful to Dov for mentioning Ronald Reagan and Reagan's statement about destroying the Berlin Wall. I can send Dov a certain history book which is describing how President Reagan made this decision. And there were obviously many contributors, but one apparently not unimportant was an article in the Washington Post making Reagan just this suggestion to call on Gorbachev to demolish the Berlin Wall. I was the author of that article. And I do know something about Reagan's thinking at that time. Reagan talked to his national security advisors, and he very carefully evaluated what would be the consequences of this appeal. He understood that Gorbachev himself was moving in that direction. He understood that Gorbachev no longer wanted to support inept and corrupt East European autocrats. Reagan knew that he could have his cake and eat it too. He could promote freedom in Eastern Europe and to promote American geopolitical interests. I am not sure that Mr. Biden and those around him have this kind of geopolitical analytical sense.
Dov, I have a related question on China for you from Joseph Bosco. He asks, is it your position that the China threat, not only to America, but to the world, began when Trump pulled out of the TPP, which Clinton also advocated at the end of the campaign? PRC hostility started much earlier than that. What's your response, Dov?
Totally agree. Pulling out of the TPP didn't help. But absolutely, I think that we've mollycoddled China far too long. They are truly more than merely a competitor. However, I would say that, and here Dimitri and I are in the same place. Our approach is simply wrong-headed. The biggest problem we've got with the Chinese, well, there are two. One is the military problem. And I think that the Defense Department is doing a decent job in trying to come up with offsets to the fact that China has just been improving its military and growing its military. And growing isn't the same as improving. They've been doing both by leaps and bounds. And so we're responding to that. But we have not responded in any kind of coherent way to the other major threat, which is the threat to our intellectual property. Tariffs simply don't do that. Yes, they've been a problem for a long time. There's no question. This is not Deng Xiaoping's China, for sure. But we have to do something. And I'm not seeing any kind of creativity other than this knee-jerk tariff stuff coming out of Mr. Trump. That's my point.
I have a question from Donald Smith that is directed at both Dimitri and Dov. And essentially his bottom line seems to be that maybe Trump's getting a bit of a bum rap. He asks, does Trump get credit for the status of the Middle East, including that of Israel, the recent agreement with UAE? He's put Iran on its heels. He's encouraging Saudi Arabia to modernize and moderate. He's neutralized ISIS, and he's kept Iraq out of Iran's sphere of influence. So argues Donald Smith. Dimitri, do you think Trump should get more credit than he's been given?
I think Trump should get more credit, obviously, for the recent deal with Israel. Having said that, I do realize that it is one of those deals which is essentially a declaration of intention, and it also would not succeed unless it would be supported by others. But so far, so very good. And in terms of Iran, look, unlike Dov, I support what Trump have decided to do in Iran. Again, not every statement he made, not every move he decided to undertake. But like Dov, I did not like the original agreement. And I thought that if you make your disagreement very clear, as Trump did during his electoral campaign, it is not inappropriate for you, when you become president, to try to withdraw from that agreement. I share those concerns that if you withdraw from too many international agreements unilaterally, it does not enhance your credibility. But I do think that in some cases, when it is an issue of great importance, and it certainly was an issue of great importance, particularly to our ally Israel, on some issues of great importance, you should be prepared to put your money where your mouth is. And I want to remind everyone, Trump did not withdraw from this agreement arbitrarily. The United States followed all appropriate procedures for withdrawing from this agreement. We have done what we have the right to do under the international law.
Dov?
Well, I'll try to address each of the points that were made in the question. First of all, in terms of Iran being on its heels, China just has agreed to a major strategic arrangement with Iran. That China's going to pour literally hundreds of billions of dollars into Iran, into all kinds of investment, including ports, in exchange for Iranian oil. So China now has a major foothold in Iran, and China is not the only one that is dealing with the Iranians. I don't think we've handled this one as well as we could have. But again, if you alienate China, you alienate Iran, they're going to get together. So there's that issue. The argument that Iran is no longer in Iraq is simply wrong. I mean, I go to Iraq about once a year. I didn't go this year yet because of the virus, but I've been going there year after year. And I know some of the leadership there. And let me tell you, those militias, the Hashdas they're called, totally under Iranian dominance. The Iranians have not been pushed out of Iraq. And that's a real serious problem for us. Some argue that they have more influence than the United States. I don't know. I think the Iraqi leadership is walking on eggs to try not to alienate either side, but they're not anywhere near out of Iraq. Now, on the UAE deal, sure, you have to give President Trump credit for helping to push this along. But this isn't the UAE-Israeli relationship of, say, when I was in the Pentagon. And by the way, at that time, I tried to get drones for the UAE and couldn't because of the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime. But now you've got a situation where first President Obama united the Gulf states and Israel against Iran and to some extent against us. And then you've got a president who's simply unreliable. And so to some extent, the Emirates and the Israelis are hedging their bets. Plus the fact that they've been working together for 10 years. They've been working together not only in intelligence, but in other areas as well, including business. And there's even a Jewish community with a synagogue and a rabbi in Abu Dhabi. There wasn't one 15 years ago. So things have been moving in that direction. They got to the 5-yard line. Did President Trump bring them over? Yes, and he gets credit for those 5 yards.
Well, we have another question from Michael Vlahos. And I think this one is probably directed at you, Dov, and it also is similar to a question from Sumantra Metra. Michael Vlahos asks, at close range, the neocon and never Trumper cohort has been unable to hide its resentment at policy defenestration, fancy word, in the imperial court. They have now migrated to the blue faction, in large part because it offers hope to renew long-standing globalism and imperialism. And this is Trump's cardinal sin. Do you disagree?
Well, Mike, good to hear from you. If you had a chance to read the book that I wrote about my time in the Pentagon, you'll see that I spent a lot of time going after the neocons. Part of my problem, I guess, is that being Jewish and in the Pentagon, everybody thought I was a neocon. Well, guess what? Some of us Jews in the Pentagon weren't neocons and really didn't like the way things had gone. I think that there are some neocons who've gravitated to Biden, and there are some Republicans. I think of Rich Armitage, who's neither Jewish nor a neocon. I think of John Negroponte, who's neither Jewish nor a neocon. and many others who simply can't stand Trump. And it's got nothing to do with being a neocon. I have always been very, very restrained about American intervention into other countries. Yeah, if there's a Cambodian crisis, some kind of genocide, maybe, probably. Beyond, but I have a very high bar. And I don't believe that we should just go around trashing countries because we don't like them. I quoted John Quincy Adams before, and I'll quote him again. He was very much against intervention. He said we should be the shining city on the hill. Reagan took his line. But being a shining city on the hill means you're still on the hill.
I have another question that I think is quite pointed, which is for both Dimitri and Dov. George Beebe of the Center for the National Interests asks, there has been much speculation that Trump might refuse to step down if he loses the election. Less thought has been given to the reverse scenario. What are the prospects that anti-Trump groups might refuse to accept a Trump victory and decide to express their opposition through riots and violent protests? Could and would Trump steer the country towards stability in such a situation? Why don't we start with you, Dimitri?
Well, I very much hope that we would not come to this situation. I do not know what Trump is going to do. On one hand, he's a decisive man and sometimes inclined to take radical steps, even when radical steps are not the best way to proceed. But obviously, he would have to deal with the military. Dov knows the mindset of top military commanders better than me. I would be interested in his opinion. But I think that if Trump tried to order the military to do something they consider unconstitutional, they would resist. And I also think that Trump would know about this resistance in advance and would have to take this into account in deciding what to do. So I'm very worried, but I would not accept that this military action or another police action on Trump's part are inevitable. There would be serious obstacles. What the mobs supportive of the Democratic Party would do is anybody's guess. And so far, of course, the Democrats, their top leaders, and their candidate, and their vice presidential candidate have done nothing to make sure that they do not support that kind of politically motivated violence. So I do think that unless the election outcome is fairly clear-cut, we may have a very bad ride. And let me say one thing at the conclusion of our discussion. I very much enjoyed debating Dov. Not only because I know Dov for many years, not just respect, but really admire him, but it does demonstrate to me that we can talk about issues we're really passionate about and have different views. We can talk about them not like this is our last apocalyptic stand. However, I think that on both sides of our great political divide, we have a situation when we don't really feel that we are fellow Americans, when we do not feel that we love the same country. I do not know what country Mr. Biden and his supporters love. They say that they love America. I trust them that they love America, they understand it. But that is not America that existed throughout history. This is not American culture. This is not American tradition. This is not American way of life. This is not American elite. So I know they love something, but I worry that their love for America is a love of revolutionaries who, in order to have America of their dreams, would be prepared to destroy something that is very important and very dear to many of us.
Dov?
Well, I share Dimitri's view that reasonable people ought to be able to disagree, even if they disagree passionately. Again, that's why I'm affiliated with the Center for the National Interest, where we invite that sort of discussion. and where different points of view can be heard and made. And George, of course, being the leader of the center, is very much in that mold. Now, as to the, I mean, this is certainly a hypothetical. Weinberger, who used to be my boss many years ago, used to say, I don't deal in hypotheticals. I can tell you one thing. The military are constitutionalists. They believe in civilian control. They're not going to go out and start doing things that they shouldn't be doing. That's number one. Number two is, in the event that Trump doesn't want to leave, and I don't know that he won't. I have no way of knowing this any more than I have any way of knowing that there'll be riots all over the country. But I do know that if there are riots, even Democratic governors have called in the National Guard. That's what the National Guard is for. I don't think that riots are exactly the way to deal with this country any more than non-leaving the White House is the way to deal with this country. This is a bitterly divided country. Do the Democrats have a different vision? Sure they do. Of course they do. I don't entirely share it. One of their premises, which is very difficult to argue with, is that the nature of our population is changing. Even if you kept every immigrant out from here on out, we have a significant collection of minorities that just didn't exist even 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's a different country. The question is, how do you take this different country and keep what was valuable about it from the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and everything since? That's a huge challenge. I don't know that the Democratic Party is in a position to meet that challenge. I think that Biden can help heal a lot of wounds. I do believe that Mr. Trump has poured salt on wounds that were already there. Biden is sir, you were about to say. I was simply going to say. I was
going to ask.
Please ask.
No, finish, and then I'll go ahead when you're done.
Okay, Joe Biden, maybe because he's been around so long, is somebody who is not one to pour salt on wounds. My feeling is, start off with doing no harm. I believe Mr. Trump has done harm, but whether either he or the Democratic Party will violate the Constitution, frankly, I don't believe they will. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt.
Well, that's an optimistic note. I have one final question for each of you, which has occurred to me in listening to our presentations. You've both accepted the status quo as it is, but we haven't asked the question, how on earth did we get to this point? And I'd like to, both of you have observed and participated in politics and American foreign policy for decades. Dimitri, Dov, and I'll start with Dimitri. How did we get to this point where we're talking about American democracy being imperiled?
Well, let me say first something I at first did not want to say, but now I think I probably should. I do think that Trump is a better choice. I'm not offering any endorsement to Trump. And being a publisher of the national interest, I normally don't vote in presidential elections. So I do not want whatever I have said to be perceived as either a personal endorsement or anything that would be reflective of the Center for the National Interest position. But I think you have asked a fundamental question, which probably deserves a special session. But let me say that to a large extent, my somewhat optimistic attitude to Trump is precisely because I think that Trump was elected for a reason. I think that Trump's election reflected a disillusionment of many, if not most, Americans with the way these things were going, the way the country was ruled. I think that Trump was an outsider in the Republican Party. He did not have any real policy credentials. He was able to prevail over people like a hero, John McCain, because the country and the Republican base were tired of old political correctness and old formulas. In this sense, Trump is an agent of change. He is an imperfect agent of change, but he is an agent of change. And I think basically, fundamentally, despite all his faults, change that Trump is advocating is a change in the right direction.
Dov?
Well, I think we got to where we got in part because we developed a degree of hubris that we shouldn't have. After the Cold War, we thought we could do anything we wanted, anywhere we wanted, anyhow we wanted. Didn't work out entirely that way. Domestically, under Clinton, actually, we didn't really go to many big wars, even many small wars, and the economy did pretty well. But we have, after 9/11, both Republicans and Democrats simply lost sight of what ordinary people wanted. And I agree with Dimitri. I mean, a lot of people voted for Trump not because they're right-wing crazies or anything like that, or racists or anything like that, but simply because they were fed up. What I believe, though, is that they didn't get what they voted for. They didn't get somebody who really redirected the country. And let's look at the economy. Mr. Trump has constantly praised himself for what he did on the economy. But you know what? He is just as responsible for the economic disaster we're now in. You know, if you're a quarterback and you go 7 for 7 in the first quarter, and then you get intercepted 5 times, coach is going to pull you. You're not going to start the second quarter because you're responsible for the interceptions as much as for the touchdowns. That's the problem that Trump has. The economy did well. The Democrats say it started under Obama. I don't know. It doesn't matter in a sense. The economy did well, but now it's a disaster. Why is it a disaster? Because he's mishandled the disease. He's mishandled the coronavirus, the COVID-19. We don't have kids going to school. We don't have an economy that's going anywhere. We've got a disease that's killed 170,000 plus people. This guy simply does not know how to really manage. So people who voted for him for a change, they got a change all right, but a lot more than they voted for. This is not the man you want another 4 years from.
Well, that's an emphatic ending. And with that, I would like to close this lively and even impassioned session. I think it's a tribute to the Center for the National Interest that we could have such a forceful, vigorous, and ultimately polite debate between the Vice Chairman and the President and CEO, Dov Zakheim and Dimitri K. I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, and with that, I would like to end this session.